This is an audiobook edition of Jawaharlal Nehru's autobiography,
produced and narrated by Giribala Joshi.
Chapter 55 A Civil Marriage and a Question of Script. After spending about a week in Pune and Bombay in the middle of September 1933, I returned to Lucknow. My mother was still in hospital there and was improving very slowly. Kamla was also in Lucknow, trying to attend on her, although she was not very well herself. My sisters used to come over from Allahabad for the weekends. I remained in Lucknow for 2 or 3 weeks, and I had more leisure there than I was likely to have in Allahabad, my chief occupation being visits to the hospital twice daily. I utilized my spare hours in writing some articles for the press, and these were widely published all over the country. A series of articles entitled Whither India, in which I had surveyed world affairs in relation to the Indian situation, attracted considerable attention. I learnt later that these articles were even reproduced in Persian translations in Tehran and Kabul. There was nothing novel or original in these articles for anyone in touch with recent developments and modern Western thought. But in India, our people had been too engrossed in their domestic troubles to pay much attention to what was happening elsewhere. The reception given to my articles, as well as many other indications, showed that they were developing a wider outlook. My mother was getting very tired of being in hospital, and we decided to take her back to Allahabad. One of the reasons for this was my sister Krishna's engagement, which had just then been announced. We wanted to have the marriage as soon as possible, before I was suddenly removed to prison again. I had no notion how long I would be allowed to remain out, as civil disobedience was still the official program of the Congress, and the Congress itself and scores of other organizations were illegal. We fixed the marriage for the 3rd week of October in Allahabad. It was to be a civil ceremony. I was glad of this, though as a matter of fact we had no choice in the matter. The marriage was between 2 different castes, a Brahmin and a non-Brahmin, and under present British Indian law no religious ceremony had validity for such a marriage. Fortunately, a recently passed Civil Marriage Act came to our rescue. There were 2 such acts, the second one, under which my sister's marriage took place, being confined to Hindus and those belonging to allied faiths, Buddhists, Jains, Sikhs. But if either party does not belong to one of these faiths, by birth or conversion, then this second act does not apply, and the first Civil Marriage Act has to be resorted to. This first act requires from both the parties a denunciation of all the leading religions, or at any rate a statement that they do not belong to them. This wholly unnecessary denunciation is a great nuisance. Many people, even though they are not religiously inclined, object to this statement and thus cannot take advantage of the act. The orthodox of various faiths oppose all changes which would facilitate intermarriages. The result is that they drive people either to make that statement of denunciation or to a patently superficial conversion to get within the law. Personally, I should like to encourage intermarriages, but whether they are encouraged or not, it is very necessary to have a permissive General Civil Marriage Act applicable to persons of all religions, permitting them to marry without any denunciation or change of faith. There was no fuss about my sister's wedding. It was a very simple affair. Ordinarily, I dislike the fuss attendant on Indian marriages. In view of my mother's illness, and even more so, the fact that civil disobedience was still going on and many of our colleagues were in prison, anything in the nature of show was singularly out of place. Only a few relatives and local friends were invited. Many old friends of my father's were hurt because they felt, quite wrongly, that I had purposely ignored them. The little invitation we issued for the wedding was written in Hindustani in the Latin script. This was an innovation, as such invitations are always either in the Nagri or the Persian script, and the idea of writing Hindustani in the Latin script is almost unknown, except in army and missionary circles. I used the Latin script as an experiment, and I wanted to see the reactions of various people. It had a mixed reception, mostly unfavorable. The recipients were few. If a larger circle had been approached, the reaction would have been still more unfavorable. Gandhiji did not approve of what I had done. I did not use the Latin script because I had become a convert to it, although it had long attracted me. Its success in Turkey and Central Asia had impressed me, and the obvious arguments in its favor were weighty. But even so, I was not convinced, and even if I had been convinced, I knew well that it did not stand the faintest chance of being adopted in present-day India. There would be the most violent opposition to it from all groups, nationalist, religious, Hindu, Muslim, old and new. And I feel that the opposition would not be merely based on emotion. A change of script is a very vital change for any language with a rich past, for a script is a most intimate part of its literature. Change the script and different word pictures arise, different sounds, different ideas. An almost insurmountable barrier is put up between the old literature and the new, and the former becomes almost a foreign language that is dead. Where there is no literature worth preserving, this risk should be taken. In India, I can hardly conceive of the change, for our literature is not only rich and valuable, but is bound up with our history and our thought, and is intimately connected with the lives of our masses. It would be cruel vivisection to force such a change, and it would retard our progress in popular education. But this question is not even an academic one in India today. The next step in script reform for us seems to me the adoption of a common script for the daughter languages of Sanskrit: Hindi, Bengali, Marathi, and Gujarati. As it is, their scripts have a common origin and do not differ greatly, and it should not be difficult to strike a common mean. This would bring these four great sister languages much nearer to each other. One of the legends about India which our English rulers have persistently circulated all over the world is that India has several hundred languages. I forget the exact number. For proof there is the census. Of these several hundred, it is an extraordinary fact that very few Englishmen know even one moderately well, in spite of a lifelong residence in this country. They class the lot of these together and call them the vernacular, the slave language, from the Latin verna, a home-born slave, and many of our people have unknowingly accepted this nomenclature. It is astonishing how English people spend a lifetime in India without taking the trouble to learn the language well. They have evolved, with the help of their Kansamas and Ayas, an extraordinary jargon, a kind of pidgin Hindustani, which they imagine is the real article. Just as they take their facts about Indian life from their subordinates and sycophants, they take their ideas about Hindustani from their domestic servants, who make a point of speaking their pidgin language to the Sahib log for fear that they would not understand anything else. They seem to be wholly ignorant of the fact that Hindustani, as well as the other Indian languages, have high literary merit and extensive literatures. If the census tells us that India has 200 or 300 languages, it also tells us, I believe, that Germany has about 50 or 60 languages. I do not remember anyone pointing out this fact in proof of the disunity or disparity of Germany. As a matter of fact, a census mentions all manner of petty languages, sometimes spoken by a few thousand persons only, and often dialects are classed, for scientific purposes, as different languages. India seems to me to have surprisingly few languages, considering its area. Compared to the same area in Europe, it is far more closely allied in regard to language, but because of widespread illiteracy, common standards have not developed and dialects have formed. The principal languages of India, excluding Burma, are Hindustani, of the two varieties, Hindi and Urdu, Bengali, Gujarati, Marathi, Tamil, Telugu, Malayalam, and Kanris. If Assamese, Oriya, Sindhi, Pashto, and Punjabi are added, the whole country is covered, except for some hill and forest tribes. Of these, the Indo-Aryan languages, which cover the whole north, center, and west of India, are closely allied. And the southern Dravidian languages, though different, have been greatly influenced by Sanskrit and are full of Sanskrit words. The 8 principal languages mentioned above have all old and valuable literatures, and each of them is spoken today over a vast area which is definite and clearly marked. Thus, from the point of view of numbers speaking a language, these languages are among the major languages of the world. 50 million people speak Bengali. As for Hindustani, with its variations, it is spoken, I imagine, I have no figures here, by about 140 millions in India, and it is partly understood by a vast number of others all over the country. Footnote: the following figures have been given by the advocates of Hindustani. I do not know if they are based on the last census of 1931 or the previous one of 1921. I imagine they refer to the latter, and up-to-date figures would show a considerable increase under each head. In millions, Hindustani, including Western Hindi, Punjab and Rajasthani, 139.3, Bengali, 49.3, Telugu 23.6, Marathi 18.8, Tamil 18.8, Kanris 10.3, Oriya 10.1, Gujarati 9.6, total 279.8. Some languages like Pashto, Assamese, and of course Burmese, which is entirely different linguistically and territorially, have been omitted from this list. End of footnote. Such a language has obviously enormous possibilities. It rests on the solid foundation of Sanskrit, and it is closely allied to Persian. Thus it can draw from two rich sources, and of course in recent years it has drawn from English. The Dravidian country in the south is the only part where Hindustani comes as almost a foreign tongue, but the people there are making a great effort to learn it. 2 years ago, in 1932, I saw some figures of a private voluntary society which had undertaken the teaching of Hindi in the south. During the previous 14 years since its formation, it was stated that 550,000 persons had learned Hindi through its efforts in the Madras Presidency alone. For a voluntary effort, which is supported in no way by the state, this is remarkable, and most of the persons who learn Hindi themselves become missionaries in the cause. I have no doubt whatever that Hindustani is going to be the common language of India. Indeed, it is largely so today for ordinary purposes. Its progress has been hampered by foolish controversies about the script, Nagari or Persian, and by the misdirected efforts of the two factions to use language which is either too Sanskritized or too Persianized. There is no way out of the script difficulty, for it arouses great heat and passion, except to adopt both officially and allow people to use either. But an effort must be made to discourage the extreme tendencies and develop a middle literary language on the lines of the spoken language in common use. With mass education, this will inevitably take place. At present, the small middle-class groups that are supposed to be the arbiters of literary taste and style are terribly narrow-minded and conservative, each in its own way. They cling to antique forms that have no life in them and have few contacts with their own masses or with world literature. The development and spread of Hindustani must not and will not conflict with the continued use and enrichment of the other great languages of India, Bengali, Gujarati, Marathi, Oriya, and the Dravidian languages of the south. Some of these languages are already more wide awake and intellectually alert than Hindustani, and they must remain the official languages for educational and other purposes in their respective areas. Only through them can education and culture spread rapidly among the masses. Some people imagine that English is likely to become the lingua franca of India. That seems to me a fantastic conception, except in respect of a handful of upper-class intelligentsia. It has no relation to the problem of mass education and culture. It may be, as it is partly today, that English will become increasingly a language used for technical, scientific, and business communications, and especially for international contacts. It is essential for many of us to know foreign languages in order to keep in touch with world thought and activities, and I should like our universities to encourage the learning of other languages besides English, French, German, Russian, Spanish, Italian. This does not mean that English should be neglected, but if we are to have a balanced view of the world, we must not confine ourselves to English spectacles. We have already become sufficiently lopsided in our mental outlook because of this concentration on one aspect and ideology, and even the most rabid of our nationalists hardly realize how much they are cribbed and confined by the British outlook in relation to India. But however much we may encourage the other foreign languages, English is bound to remain our chief link with the outside world. That is as it should be. For generations past we have been trying to learn English, and we have achieved a fair measure of success in the endeavor. It would be folly to wipe the slate clean now, and not to take full advantage of this long training. English also is today undoubtedly the most widespread and important world language, and it is gaining fast on the other languages. It is likely to become more and more the medium of international intercourse and radio broadcasting, unless American takes its place. Therefore, we must continue to spread the knowledge of English. It is desirable to learn it as well as possible, but it does not seem to me worthwhile for us to spend too much time and energy in appreciating the finer points of the language, as many of us do now. Individuals may do that, but to set it as an ideal for large numbers is to put a needless burden on them and prevent them from progressing in other directions. I have been greatly attracted lately by basic English, and it seems to me that this extreme simplification of English has a great future before it. It would be desirable for us to undertake the teaching of basic English on an extensive scale rather than standard English, which can be left to specialists and particular students. I would personally like to encourage Hindustani to adapt and assimilate many words from English and other foreign languages. This is necessary, as we lack modern terms, and it is better to have well-known words rather than to evolve new and difficult words from the Sanskrit or Persian or Arabic. Purists object to the use of foreign words, but I think they make a great mistake, for the way to enrich our language is to make it flexible and capable of assimilating words and ideas from other languages. I happened to go, soon after my sister's wedding, to Benares to visit an old friend and colleague, Shiv Prasad Gupta, who had been lying ill for over a year. He was in Lucknow jail when he had a sudden attack of paralysis, and he had been recovering from it very slowly ever since. During my Benares visit, a small Hindi literary society gave me an address, and I had a pleasant informal talk with its members. I told them that I hesitated to speak to experts on subjects I knew little about, but still I made a few suggestions. I criticized the intricate and ornate language that was customary in Hindi writing, full of difficult Sanskrit words, artificial and clinging to ancient forms. I ventured to suggest that this courtly style, addressed to a select audience, should be given up, and Hindi writers should deliberately write for the masses and in language understood by them. Mass contacts would give new life and sincerity to the language, and the writers themselves would catch some of the emotional energy of the mass and do far better work. Further, I suggested that if Hindi authors paid more attention to Western thought and literature, they would derive great benefit from it. It would be desirable to have translations from the classics of the European languages as well as from books dealing with modern ideas. I also mentioned that probably modern Bengali, Gujarati, and Marathi were a little more advanced in these matters than modern Hindi, and certainly more creative work had been done in Bengali in recent years than in Hindi. We had a friendly talk about these matters, and then I came away. I had no idea that my remarks would be sent to the press, but someone present sent a report to the Hindi papers. And then there was a tremendous outcry in the Hindi press against me, and at my presumption in criticizing Hindi and comparing it to its disadvantage with Bengali, Gujarati, and Marathi. I was called an ignoramus, which indeed I was in that particular subject, and many harder words were used to squash and suppress me. I had no time to follow the controversy, and it went on, I am told, for months, till I was again in prison. This incident was a revelation to me. It revealed the extraordinary sensitiveness of Hindi literary men and journalists, and their refusal to face a little honest criticism from one who wished them well. The inferiority complex was evidently at work. Self-criticism there was none at all, and critical standards were poor. It was not unusual for an author and his critic to fall out and accuse each other of personal motives. The whole outlook was narrow, bourgeois, and parochial, and both the journalist and the authors seemed to write for each other and for a small circle, ignoring the vast public and its interests. It seemed to me an extraordinary pity and an unhappy waste of energy when the field was so vast and inviting. Hindi literature has a fine past, but it cannot live forever on its past. I feel sure that it has a great future and that Hindi journalism will be a tremendous power in this country. But neither will progress much till it shakes itself free of narrow conventions and boldly addresses the masses. End of Chapter 55. Chapter 56. Communalism and Reaction. About the time of my sister's wedding came news of Vittalbhai J. Patel's death in Europe. He had long been ailing, and it was because of his ill health that he had been released from prison in India. His passing away was a painful event, and the thought of our veteran leaders leaving us in this way, one after another, in the middle of our struggle, was an extraordinarily depressing one. Many tributes were paid to Vittalbhai, and most of these laid stress on his ability as a parliamentarian and his success as President of the Assembly. This was perfectly true, and yet this repetition irritated me. Was there any lack of good parliamentarians in India, or of people who could fill the Speaker's chair with ability? That was the one job for which our lawyers' training had fitted us. Vittalbhai had been something much more than that. He had been a great and indomitable fighter for India's freedom. During my visit to Benares in November, I was invited to address the students of the Hindu University. I gladly accepted this invitation and addressed a huge gathering presided over by Pandit Madan Mohan Malviya, the Vice-Chancellor. In the course of my speech, I had much to say about communalism, and I denounced it in forcible language and especially condemned the activities of the Hindu Mahasabha. This was not exactly a premeditated attack, but for a long time past my mind had been full of resentment at the increasingly reactionary efforts of the communalists of all groups, and as I warmed up to my subject, some of this resentment came out. Deliberately I laid stress on the reactionary character of the Hindu communalists, for there was no point in my criticizing Muslims before a Hindu audience. At the moment, it did not strike me that it was not in the best of taste to criticize the Hindu Mahasabha at a meeting presided over by Malviyaji, who had long been one of its pillars. I did not think of this, as he had not had much to do with it lately, and it almost seemed that the new aggressive leaders of the Mahasabha had pushed him out. So long as he had been one of the leading spirits, the Mahasabha, in spite of its communalism, had not been politically reactionary. But latterly this new development has become very patent, and I felt sure that Malviyaji could not have anything to do with it and must have disapproved of it. Still, it was not quite right for me, as I realized later, to have taken an undue advantage of his invitation by making remarks which put him in an awkward position. I was sorry for this. I was also sorry for a foolish error into which I had fallen. Someone sent us by post a copy of a resolution which, it stated, had recently been passed in Ajmer by a Hindu young men's organization. This resolution was most objectionable, and I referred to it in my Benares speech. As a matter of fact, no such resolution had been passed by any organization, and we had been the victims of a hoax. My Benares speech, briefly reported, created an uproar. Used as I was to such outcries, I was quite taken aback by the vehemence of the attack of the Hindu Mahasabha leaders. These attacks were largely personal and seldom touched the point in issue. They overreached themselves, and soon I was glad of them, for they gave me an opportunity for having my say on the subject. I had been bursting with it for months past, even when I was in prison, but did not know how to tackle it. It was a hornet's nest. and though I was used to hornets, it was no pleasure to enter into controversies which degenerated into abuse. But now I had no choice, and I wrote what I considered a reasoned article on Hindu and Muslim communalism, showing how in neither case was it even bona fide communalism, but was political and social reaction hiding behind the communal mask. I happened to possess odd newspaper cuttings, which I had collected in prison, of various speeches and statements of communal leaders. Indeed, I had so much material that I was hard put to it how to compress it in a newspaper article. This article of mine was given great publicity in the Indian press. But strange to say, there was no response to it from either side, Hindu or Muslim communalists, although there was a great deal about both in my article. The Hindu Mahasabha leaders, who had denounced me in the most vigorous and varied language, now remained perfectly silent. From the Muslim side, Sir Mohammed Iqbal endeavoured to correct some of my facts regarding the second round table conference, but otherwise he did not say anything about my argument. It was in my reply to him that I suggested that a constituent assembly should decide both the political and communal issues. Later, I wrote 1 or 2 additional articles on communalism. I was very much heartened, not only by the reception of all these articles, but by the visible effect they were producing on people who tried to think. I did not imagine, of course, that I could conjure away the passions that underlay the communal spirit. My object was to point out that the communal leaders were allied to the most reactionary elements in India and England, and were in reality opposed to political and even more so to social advance. All their demands had no relation whatever to the masses. They were meant only to bring some advancement to the small groups at the top. It was my intention to carry on with this reasoned attack when prison claimed me again. The oft-repeated appeal for Hindu-Muslim unity, useful as it no doubt is, seemed to me singularly inane unless some effort was made to understand the causes of the disunity. Some people, however, seem to imagine that by a frequent repetition of the magic formula, unity will ultimately emerge. It is interesting to trace British policy since the rising of 1857 in its relation to the communal question. Fundamentally and inevitably, it has been one of preventing the Hindu and Muslim from acting together and of playing off one community against another. After 1857, the heavy hand of the British fell more on the Muslims than on the Hindus. They considered the Muslims more aggressive and militant, possessing memories of recent rule in India, and therefore more dangerous. The Muslims had also kept away from the new education and had few jobs under the government. All this made them suspect. The Hindus had taken far more kindly to the English language and clerkly jobs and seemed to be more docile. The new nationalism then grew up from above, the upper-class English-speaking intelligentsia, and this was naturally confined to the Hindus, for the Muslims were educationally very backward. This nationalism spoke in the gentlest and most abject of tones, and yet it was not to the liking of the government, and they decided to encourage the Muslims more and keep them away from the new nationalist platform. Lack of English education was in itself a sufficient bar then, so far as the Muslims were concerned, but this was bound to go gradually. With foresight, the British provided for the future, and in this task they were helped by an outstanding personality, Sir Syed Ahmed Khan. Sir Syed was unhappy about the backward condition of his community, especially in education, and he was distressed at the lack of favour and influence it had in the eyes of the British government. Like many of his contemporaries, he was a great admirer of the British, and a visit to Europe seems to have had a most powerful effect on him. Europe, or rather Western Europe, of the second half of the 19th century, was at the height of its civilization, the unchallenged mistress of the world, with all the qualities that had made it great most in evidence. The upper classes were secure in their inheritance, and adding to it, with little fear of a successful challenge. It was the age of a growing liberalism and a firm belief in a great destiny. It is not surprising that the Indians who went there were fascinated by this imposing spectacle. More Hindus went there to begin with, and they returned admirers of Europe and England. Gradually they got used to the shine and glamour, and the first surprise wore off. But in Sir Syed's case, that first surprise and fascination is very much in evidence. Visiting England in 1869, he wrote letters home giving his impressions. In one of these he stated, "The result of all this is that although I do not absolve the English in India of discourtesy, and of looking upon the natives of that country as animals and beneath contempt, I think they do so from not understanding us. And I am afraid I must confess that they are not far wrong in their opinion of us. Without flattering the English, I can truly say that the natives of India, high and low, merchants and petty shopkeepers, educated and illiterate, when contrasted with the English in education, manners, and uprightness, are as like them as a dirty animal is to an able and handsome man. The English have reason for believing us in India to be imbecile brutes. What I have seen, and seen daily, is utterly beyond the imagination of a native of India. All good things, spiritual and worldly, which should be found in man, have been bestowed by the Almighty on Europe, and especially on England." This quotation has been taken from Hans Koh's History of Nationalism in the East. Greater praise no man could give to the British and to Europe, and it is obvious that Sir Syed was tremendously impressed. Perhaps also he used strong language and heightened the contrasts in order to shake up his own people out of their torpor and induce them to take a step forward. This step, he was convinced, must be in the direction of Western education. Without that education, his community would become more and more backward and powerless. English education meant government jobs, security, influence, honor. So to this education he turned all his energy, trying to win over his community to his way of thinking. He wanted no diversions or distractions from other directions. It was a difficult enough piece of work to overcome the inertia and hesitation of the Muslims. The beginnings of a new nationalism, sponsored by the Hindu bourgeoisie, seemed to him to offer such a distraction, and he opposed it. The Hindus, half a century ahead in Western education, could indulge in this pastime of criticizing the government, but he had counted on the full cooperation of that government in his educational undertakings, and he was not going to risk this by any premature step. So he turned his back on the infant National Congress, and the British government were only too willing to encourage this attitude. Sir Syed's decision to concentrate on Western education for Muslims was undoubtedly a right one. Without that, they could not have played any effective part in the building up of Indian nationalism of the new type, and they would have been doomed to play second fiddle to the Hindus with their better education and far stronger economic position. The Muslims were not historically or ideologically ready then for the bourgeois nationalist movement, as they had developed no bourgeoisie as the Hindus had done. Sir Syed's activities, therefore, although seemingly very moderate, were in the right revolutionary direction. The Muslims were still wrapped up in a feudal anti-democratic ideology, while the rising middle class among the Hindus had begun to think in terms of the European liberals. Both were thoroughly moderate and dependent on British rule. Sir Syed's moderation was the moderation of the landlord class to which the handful of well-to-do Muslims belonged. The Hindu's moderation was that of the cautious professional or businessman seeking an outlet for industry and investment. These Hindu politicians looked up to the shining lights of English liberalism, Gladstone, Bright, etc. I doubt if the Muslims did so. Probably they admired the Tories and the landed classes of England. Gladstone, indeed, was their bête noire because of his repeated condemnation of Turkey and the Armenian massacres. And because Disraeli seemed to be more friendly to Turkey, they, that is of course the handful who took interest in such matters, were to some extent partial to him. Some of Sir Syed Ahmad Khan's speeches make strange reading today. At a speech delivered in Lucknow in December 1887, he seems to have criticized and condemned the very moderate demands of the National Congress, which was holding its annual sessions just then. Sir Syed said, If government fight Afghanistan or conquer Burma, it is no business of ours to criticize its policy. Government has made a council for making laws. For this council, she selects from all provinces those officials who are best acquainted with the administration and the condition of the people, and also some raises who, on account of their high social position, are worthy of a seat in that assembly. Some people may ask, why should they be chosen on account of social position instead of ability? I ask you, would our aristocracy like that a man of low caste or insignificant origin, though he be a B.A. or M.A. and have the requisite ability, should be in a position of authority above them and have power in making the laws that affect their lives and property? Never! None but a man of good breeding can the viceroy take as his colleague, treat as his brother, and invite to entertainments at which he may have to dine with dukes and earls. Can we say that the government, in the method it has adopted for legislation, acts without regard to the opinions of the people? Can we say that we have no share in the making of the laws? Most certainly not. Taken from Hans Koh's History of Nationalism in the East. Thus spoke the leader and representative of the democracy of Islam in India. It is doubtful if even the talukdars of Awadh or the landed magnates of Agra province, Bihar or Bengal would venture to speak in this vein today. And yet Sir Syed was by no means unique in this. Many of the Congress speeches read equally strangely today. But it seems clear that the political and economic aspect of the Hindu-Muslim question then was this: the rising and economically better equipped middle class Hindu was resisted and checked to some extent by part of the feudal landlord class, Muslim. The Hindu landlords were often closely connected with their bourgeoisie, and thus remained neutral or even sympathetic to the middle class demands which were often influenced by them. The British, as always, sided with the feudal elements. The masses and the lower middle classes on either side were not in the picture at all. Sir Syed's dominating and forceful personality impressed itself on the Indian Muslims, and the Aligarh College became the visible emblem of his hopes and desires. In a period of transition, a progressive impulse may soon play out its part and be reduced to functioning as a brake. The Indian Liberals are an obvious example of this. They remind us often that they are the true heirs of the old Congress tradition, and we of a later day are interlopers, true enough. But they forget that the world changes and the old Congress tradition has vanished with the snows of yesteryear and only remain as a memory. So also Sir Syed's message was appropriate and necessary when it came, but it could not be the final ideal of a progressive community. It is possible that had he lived a generation later, he would himself have given another orientation to that message, or other leaders could have reinterpreted his old message and applied it to changing conditions. But the very success that came to Sir Syed and the reverence that clung to his memory made it difficult for others to depart from the old faith, and unhappily the Muslims of India were strangely lacking in men of outstanding ability who could point a new way. Aligarh College did fine work, produced a large number of competent men, and changed the whole tone of the Muslim intelligentsia, but still it could not wholly get out of the framework in which it was built. A feudal spirit reigned over it, and the goal of the average student's ambition was government service. Not for him the adventures of the spirit or the quest of the stars. He was happy if he got a deputy collectorship. His pride was soothed by his being reminded that he was a unit in the great democracy of Islam, and in witness of this brotherhood he wore jauntily on his head the red cap called the Turkish fez, which the Turks themselves soon afterwards were going to discard utterly. Having assured himself of his inalienable right to democracy, which enabled him to feed and pray with his brother Muslims, he did not worry about the existence or otherwise of political democracy in India. This narrow outlook and hankering after government service was not confined to the Muslim students of Aligarh and elsewhere. It was equally in evidence among the Hindu students who were far from being adventurous by nature. But circumstances forced many of them out of the rut. There were far too many of them and not enough jobs to go round, and so they became the déclassé intellectuals who are the backbone of national revolutionary movements. The Indian Muslims had not wholly recovered from the cramping effects of Sir Syed Ahmad Khan's political message when the events of the early years of the 20th century helped the British government to widen the breach between them and the nationalist movement, now clamant and aggressive. Sir Valentine Kirrol wrote in 1910 in his Indian Unrest, "It may be confidently asserted that never before have the Mohammedans of India as a whole identified their interests and their aspirations so closely as at the present day with the consolidation and permanence of British rule." Political prophecies are dangerous. Within 5 years after Sir Valentine wrote, the Muslim intelligentsia was trying hard to break through from the fetters that kept it back and to range itself beside the Congress. Within a decade, the Indian Muslims seemed to have outstripped the Congress and were actually giving the lead to it. But these 10 years were momentous years, and the Great War had come and gone and left a broken-down world as a legacy. And yet Sir Valentine had superficially every reason to come to the conclusion he did. The Aga Khan had emerged as the leader of the Muslims, and that fact alone showed that they still clung to their feudal traditions, for the Aga Khan was no bourgeois leader. He was an exceedingly wealthy prince and the religious head of a sect, and from the British point of view, he was very much a persona grata because of his close association with the British ruling classes. He was widely cultured and lived mostly in Europe, the life of a wealthy English landed magnate and sportsman. He was thus far from being personally narrow-minded on communal or sectarian matters. His leadership of the Muslims meant the lining up of the Muslim landed classes as well as the growing bourgeoisie with the British government. The communal problem was really secondary and was obviously stressed in the interests of the main objective. Sir Valentine Kirrol tells us that the Aga Khan impressed upon Lord Minto, the Viceroy, the Mohammedan view of the political situation created by the partition of Bengal, lest political concessions should be hastily made to the Hindus, which would pave the way for the ascendancy of a Hindu majority equally dangerous to the stability of British rule and to the interests of the Mohammedan minority whose loyalty was beyond dispute. But behind this superficial lining up with the British government, other forces were working. Inevitably, the new Muslim bourgeoisie was feeling more and more dissatisfied with existing conditions and was being drawn towards the nationalist movement. The Aga Khan himself had to take notice of this and to warn the British in characteristic language. He wrote in the Edinburgh Review of January 1914, that is, long before the war, advising the government to abandon the policy of separating Hindus from Muslims and to rally the moderate of both creeds in a common camp so as to provide a counterpoise to the radical nationalist tendencies of young India, both Hindu and Muslim. It was thus clear that he was far more interested in checking political change in India than in the communal interests of Muslims. But the Aga Khan or the British government could not stop the inevitable drift of the Muslim bourgeoisie towards nationalism. The World War hastened the process, and as new leaders arose, the Aga Khan seemed to retire into the background. Even Aligarh College changed its tone, and among the new leaders, the most dynamic were the Ali brothers, both products of Aligarh. Dr. M.A. Ansari, Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, and a number of other bourgeois leaders now began to play an important part in the political affairs of the Muslims. So also, on a more moderate scale, Mr. M.A. Jinnah. Gandhiji swept most of these leaders, not Mr. Jinnah, and the Muslims generally into his non-cooperation movement, and they played a leading part in the events of 1919 to 23. Then came the reaction, and communal and backward elements, both among the Hindus and the Muslims, began to emerge from their enforced retirement. It was a slow process, but it was a continuous one. The Hindu Mahasabha for the first time assumed some prominence, chiefly because of the communal tension, but politically it could not make much impression on the Congress. The Muslim communal organizations were more successful in regaining some of their old prestige among the Muslim masses. Even so, a very strong group of Muslim leaders remained throughout with the Congress. The British government, meanwhile, gave every encouragement to the Muslim communal leaders who were politically thoroughly reactionary. Noting the success of these reactionaries, the Hindu Mahasabha began to compete with them in reaction, thereby hoping to win the goodwill of the government. Many of the progressive elements in the Mahasabha were driven out or left of their own accord, and it inclined more and more towards the upper middle classes, and especially the creditor and banker class. The communal politicians on both sides, who were interminably arguing about percentages of seats in legislatures, thought only in terms of patronage which influence in government gives. It was a struggle for jobs for the middle-class intelligentsia. There were obviously not enough jobs to go round, and so the Hindu and Muslim communalists quarrelled about them, the former on the defensive, for they had most of the existing jobs, the latter always wanting more and more. Behind this struggle for jobs there was a much more important contest, which was not exactly communal, but which influenced the communal issue. On the whole, the Hindus were, in the Punjab, Sindh, and Bengal, the richer creditor, urban class. The Muslims in these provinces were the poorer, debtor, rural class. The conflict between the two was therefore often economic, but it was always given a communal colouring. In recent months, this has come out very prominently in the debates on various provincial bills for reducing the burden of rural debt, especially in the Punjab. The representatives of the Hindu Mahasabha have consistently opposed these measures and sided with the banker class. The Hindu Mahasabha is always laying stress on its own irreproachable nationalism when it criticizes Muslim communalism. That the Muslim organizations have shown themselves to be quite extraordinarily communal has been patent to everybody. The Mahasabha's communalism has not been so obvious, as it masquerades under a nationalist cloak. The test comes when a national and democratic solution happens to injure upper-class Hindu interests, and in this test the Mahasabha has repeatedly failed. The separation of Sindh has been consistently opposed by them in the economic interests of a minority and against the declared wishes of the majority. But the most extraordinary exhibition of anti-nationalism and reaction, both on the part of Muslim and Hindu communalists, took place at the Round Table conferences. The British government had insisted on nominating only definitely communal Muslims, and these, under the leadership of the Aga Khan, actually went to the length of allying themselves with the most reactionary, and from the point of view not only of India but of all progressive groups, the most dangerous elements in British public life. It was quite extraordinary to see the close association of the Aga Khan and his group with Lord Lloyd and his party. They went a step further and made pacts with the representatives of the European Association and others at the RTC. This was very depressing, for this association has been and is in India the stoutest and the most aggressive opponent of Indian freedom. The Hindu Mahasabha delegates responded to this by demanding, especially in the Punjab, all manner of checks on freedom, safeguards in the interests of the British. They tried to outbid the Muslims in their attempts to offer cooperation to the British government, and without gaining anything, damned their own case and betrayed the cause of freedom. The Muslims had at least spoken with dignity, the Hindu communalists did not even possess this. The outstanding fact seems to me how, on both sides, the communal leaders represent a small upper-class reactionary group, and how these people exploit and take advantage of the religious passions of the masses for their own ends. On both sides, every effort is made to suppress and avoid the consideration of economic issues. Soon the time will come when these issues can no longer be suppressed, and then, no doubt, the communal leaders on both sides will echo the Aga Khan's warning of 20 years ago for the moderates to join hands in a common camp against radical tendencies. To some extent that is already evident, for however much the Hindu and Muslim communalists attack each other in public, they cooperate in the assembly and elsewhere in helping government to pass reactionary measures. Ottawa was one of the links which brought the three together. Meanwhile, it is interesting to notice that the Aga Khan's close association with the extreme right wing of the Conservative Party continues. In October 1934, he was the guest of honour at the British Navy League dinner at which Lord Lloyd presided, and he supported wholeheartedly the proposals for further strengthening the British Navy, which Lord Lloyd had made at the Bristol Conservative Conference. An Indian leader was thus so anxious about imperial defence and the safety of England that he wanted to go further in increasing British armaments than even Mr. Baldwin or the national government. Of course, this was all in the interest of peace. The next month, in November 1934, it was reported that a film was privately shown in London, the object of which was to link the Muslim world in lasting friendship with the British Crown. We were informed that the guests of honour on this occasion were the Aga Khan and Lord Lloyd. It would seem that the Aga Khan and Lord Lloyd have become almost as inseparably united, two hearts that beat as one, in imperial affairs as Sir Tej Bahadur Sapru and Mr. M.R. Jaikar are in our national politics. And it is worth noticing that during these months when the two were so frequently communing with each other, Lord Lloyd was leading a bitter and unrelenting attack on the official Conservative leadership and the national government for their alleged weakness in giving too much to India. Footnote: recently a council of some British peers and Indian Muslims has been formed to cement and further the union of these extreme reactionary elements. End of footnote. Latterly, there has been an interesting development in the speeches and statements of some of the Muslim communal leaders. This has no real importance, but I doubt if many people think so. Nevertheless, it is significant of the mentality of communalism, and a great deal of prominence has been given to it. Stress has been laid on the Muslim nation in India, on Muslim culture, on the utter incompatibility of Hindu and Muslim cultures. The inevitable deduction from this is, although it is not put boldly, that the British must remain in India forever and ever to hold the scales and mediate between the two cultures. A few Hindu communal leaders think exactly on the same lines, with this difference, however, that they hope that being in a majority, their brand of culture will ultimately prevail. Hindu and Muslim cultures, and the Muslim nation, how these words open out fascinating vistas of past history and present and future speculation. The Muslim nation in India, a nation within a nation, and not even compact, but vague, spread out, indeterminate. Politically, the idea is absurd. Economically, it is fantastic. It is hardly worth considering. And yet it helps us a little to understand the mentality behind it. Some such separate and unmixable nations existed together in the Middle Ages and afterwards. In the Constantinople of the early days of the Ottoman sultans, each such nation lived separately and had a measure of autonomy, Latin Christians, Orthodox Christians, Jews, etc. This was the beginning of extraterritoriality, which in more recent times became such a nightmare to many Eastern countries. To talk of a Muslim nation, therefore, means that there is no nation at all but a religious bond. It means that no nation in the modern sense must be allowed to grow. It means that modern civilization should be discarded and we should go back to the medieval ways. It means either autocratic government or a foreign government. It means, finally, just nothing at all except an emotional state of mind and a conscious or unconscious desire not to face realities, especially economic realities. Emotions have a way of upsetting logic, and we may not ignore them simply because they seem so unreasonable. But this idea of a Muslim nation is the figment of a few imaginations only, and but for the publicity given to it by the press, few people would have heard of it. And even if many people believed in it, it would still vanish at the touch of reality. So also the ideas of Hindu and Muslim culture. The day of even national cultures is rapidly passing and the world is becoming one cultural unit. Nations may retain, and will retain for a long time much that is peculiar to them, language, habits, ways of thought, etc. But the machine age and science, with swift travel, constant supply of world news, radio, cinema, etc., will make them more and more uniform. No one can fight against this inevitable tendency, and only a world catastrophe which shatters modern civilization can really check it. There are certainly many differences between the traditional Hindu and Muslim philosophies of life, but these differences are hardly noticeable when both of them are compared to the modern scientific and industrial outlook on life, for between this latter and the former two there is a vast gulf. The real struggle today in India is not between Hindu culture and Muslim culture, but between these two and the conquering scientific culture of modern civilization. Those who are desirous of preserving Muslim culture need not worry about Hindu culture, but should withstand the giant from the West. I have no doubt personally that all efforts, Hindu or Muslim, to oppose modern scientific and industrial civilization are doomed to failure, and I shall watch this failure without regret. Our choice was unconsciously and involuntarily made when railways and the like came here. Sir Syed Ahmad Khan made his choice on behalf of the Indian Muslims when he started the Aligarh College. But none of us had really any choice in the matter, except the choice which a drowning man has to clutch at something which might save him. But what is this Muslim culture? Is it a kind of racial memory of the great deeds of the Arabs, Persians, Turks, etc., or language, or art and music, or customs? I do not remember anyone referring to present-day Muslim art or Muslim music. The two languages which have influenced Muslim thought in India are Arabic and Persian, and especially the latter. But the influence of Persian has no element of religion about it. The Persian language and many Persian customs and traditions came to India in the course of thousands of years and impressed themselves powerfully all over North India. Persia was the France of the East, sending its language and culture to all its neighbors. That is a common and a precious heritage for all of us in India. Pride in the past achievements of Islamic races and countries is probably one of the strongest of Islamic bonds. Does anyone grudge the Muslims this noble record of various races? No one can take it away from them, so long as they choose to remember it and cherish it. As a matter of fact, this past record is also to a large extent a common heritage for all of us, perhaps because we feel as Asiatics a common bond uniting us against the aggression of Europe. I know that whenever I have read of the conflicts of the Arabs in Spain or during the Crusades, my sympathies have always been with them. I try to be impartial and objective, but try as I will, the Asiatic in me influences my judgment when an Asiatic people are concerned. I have tried hard to understand what this Muslim culture is, but I confess that I have not succeeded. I find a tiny handful of middle-class Muslims as well as Hindus in North India influenced by the Persian language and traditions. And looking to the masses, the most obvious symbols of Muslim culture seem to be a particular type of paijama, not too long and not too short, a particular way of shaving or clipping the mustache but allowing the beard to grow, and a lota with a special kind of snout, just as the corresponding Hindu customs are the wearing of a dhoti the possession of a top-knot, and a lota of a different kind. As a matter of fact, even these distinctions are largely urban and they tend to disappear. The Muslim peasantry and industrial workers are hardly distinguishable from the Hindu. The Muslim intelligentsia seldom sports a beard, though Aligarh still fancies a red Turkish cap with a fez. Turkish it is called, although Turkey will have none of it. Muslim women have taken to the sari and are emerging rather slowly from the parda. My own tastes do not harmonize with some of those habits, and I do not fancy beards or mustaches or top knots, but I have no desire to impose my canons of taste on others, though I must confess in regard to beards that I rejoiced when Amanullah began to deal with them in summary fashion in Kabul. I must say that those Hindus and Muslims who are always looking backward, always clutching at things which are slipping away from their grasp, are a singularly pathetic sight. I do not wish to damn the past or to reject it, for there is so much that is singularly beautiful in our past. That will endure, I have no doubt. But it is not the beautiful that these people clutch at, but something that is seldom worthwhile and is often harmful. In recent years, Indian Muslims have had repeated shocks, and many of their deeply cherished notions have been shattered. Turkey, that champion of Islam, has not only ended the Khilafate, for which India put up such a brave fight in 1920, but has taken step after step away from religion. In the new Turkish constitution, an article stated that Turkey was a Muslim state, but lest there be any mistake, Kemal Pasha said in 1927, "The provision in the constitution that Turkey is a Muslim state is a compromise destined to be done away with at the first opportunity." And I believe he acted up to this hint later on. Egypt, though much more cautiously, is going the same way and keeping her politics quite apart from religion. So also the Arab countries, except Arabia itself, which is more backward. Persia is looking back to pre-Islamic days for her cultural inspiration. Everywhere religion recedes into the background and nationalism appears in aggressive garbs, and behind nationalism other isms which talk in social and economic terms. What of the Muslim nation and Muslim culture? Are they to be found in the future only in northern India, rejoicing under the benign rule of the British? If progress consists in the individual taking a broader view of what constitutes politics, our communalists, as well as our government, have deliberately and consistently aimed at the opposite of this, the narrowing of this view. End of chapter 56.